So this is chapter 23, the digestive system, and it's week 8. This is the week that we have lost, one of the weeks that we've lost because of Canada Day. And I'm going to go through the first part of chapter 23 in this set of notes and add a few things. And if there's anything that you don't understand, then obviously you can read through it on your own. And otherwise, I will answer any questions when we get back together next week and go through the second part of chapter 23. So let's get started. So the digestive system can be divided into two main groups of organs, what we call the alimentary canal or the GI tract. That's the continuous tube from the mouth right down to the anus. This is where the food is digested and absorbed. Includes things like the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine. A lot of these are separated by sphincters, which regulate the movement of material from one section of the GI tract into another. And then there's the accessory digestive organs, things that are associated with and surround the GI tract. So things like the teeth, the tongue, the gallbladder, and some important digestive glands like the salivary glands, the liver, and the pancreas. So here's a diagram that outlines all the GI tract organs as well as the accessory organs, and you should be able to identify the locations of all the structures that you see in this diagram. The digestive process involves 6 essential activities: ingestion or bringing food into the body, propulsion, which involves the swallowing and the peristalsis, movement of material through the GI tract. As far as digestion goes, there's mechanical breakdown, which involves the chewing, the churning of the stomach, and the segmentation in the small intestine. And then the digestion, which really involves all the enzymes, and most of which happens in that first section of the small intestine for breaking down fats and proteins and carbohydrates. The absorption, which involves absorbing all the nutrients that have resulted from the digestive process, as well as water, minerals, ions. All of that is most of that is absorbed in the small intestine, and the water, a lot of the water as well, is absorbed in the large intestine. And then in the end, you end up with the solid waste, the material which is removed from the body in the process of defecation. As mentioned previously, the movement of material through the digestive tract involves a process known as peristalsis, where you have smooth muscle sections that are contracting and relaxing in adjacent segments, and that moves the food along in a one-way direction. And it's also the reason why you could swallow food or water while you're standing on your head, because that smooth muscle ensures that stuff does not flow backwards, only flows in that one-way direction. As far as regulating the GI tract function, there are mechanoreceptors and chemoreceptors. These really respond to things like the stretching because of food material in the actual digestive tract, or to osmolarity or pH changes, the presence of material, or even the presence of the end products of digestion. So these would initiate reflexes that do things like they can activate or they might inhibit digestive glands from secreting digestive enzymes. They may stimulate smooth muscle to mix and or move material along. And there are both intrinsic and extrinsic controls, or internal and external control mechanisms. These involve things like both short and long reflexes. So the short reflexes being, the gut-brain, the response to the stimuli within the actual GI tract, and the long reflexes being stimuli inside or outside the GI tract, and they involve the central nervous system and the autonomic nerves. Should be noted also that hormones from cells in the stomach and the small intestine are what stimulate the target cells in either that same organ or even in different organs to secrete or to contract, so secreting digestive enzymes. So you might get a hormone released in the small intestine that then controls secretion and activity in the stomach. The enteric nervous system is really the intrinsic nerve supply of the GI tract. And as far as the numbers of neurons, there's actually more neurons in this enteric nervous system than there are in the entire spinal cord. So this is the major nerve supply for the GI tract and for the GI tract wall, which is what controls the mobility or motility. You have both submucosal nerve plexus and myenteric nerve plexus. The submucosal nerve plexus really regulate the glands and smooth muscle in the mucosa layer, and the myenteric nerve plexus really control the GI tract motility. Um, the There are long autonomic nervous system fibers that synapse with these enteric plexuses, and so you have the sympathetic impulses, which would inhibit digestive activity. So the fight or flight, which does not allow the digestive system to really be activated, and then the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest impulses, would actually stimulate digestive activities. The peritoneum is a thin, smooth membrane that lines the abdominal cavity. So there's the visceral peritoneum and there's the parietal peritoneum. So the visceral peritoneum is what really lies on the outside of most of the digestive organs, and the parietal peritoneum is another layer which lies against the body wall. And there's a cavity, the peritoneal cavity, which is in between these two peritoneum layers, and inside that cavity there's a fluid which lubricates those mobile organs and prevents any friction from happening, which might damage or inflame the digestive organs. There's also a large mass of what we call mesentery, and this is a double layer of peritoneum, and this is where a lot of the blood vessels and lymphatics and the nerves actually are routed. And uh, it also acts to hold the organs in place, and it also tends to be a site where a lot of fat is stored. It's also worth mentioning that there are what we call retroperitoneal organs and intraperitoneal organs. And the retroperitoneal organs are really the ones which are kind of posterior or behind the peritoneum, and it's things like the pancreas, for example. And there's also ones which are completely surrounded by peritoneum, which is the stomach is a good example of that. Now, if this peritoneum happens to get inflamed, um, for one, it can be very dangerous, life-threatening, but it can be caused by things like an abdominal wound, a perforating ulcer, an appendix that ruptures. That's one of the dangers why people make sure they get an inflamed appendix removed before it ruptures. So what ends up happening is those peritoneal coverings end up sticking together, and you get localized infection, and it can be very dangerous. Can be lethal if it ends up being widespread, and then treatment usually involves removing the inflamed, damaged material, so debris removal and antibiotics to deal with the infection. The splanchnic circulation or blood supply for the digestive organs branches off of the aorta. So you have the hepatic, the splenic, the gastric arteries, the inferior superior mesenteric arteries, and you also have the hepatic portal circulation, which is really what drains that nutrient-rich blood from the digestive organs. So after the material has been digested and nutrients are absorbed, that blood is drained through the hepatic portal circulation and delivers it right to the liver for processing. Along the entire length of the digestive tract, you have four layers of tissue. So you have the mucosa, going from the inside out. You have the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis externa, and the serosa. And I'll focus a bit on the mucosa in the next slide, but as far as the other three layers go, so the submucosa is where you have the blood and lymphatic vessels and the lymphoid follicles and the submucosal nerve plexus. The muscularis externa is really the section which is responsible for segmentation and peristalsis. So this has the inner circular and outer longitudinal layers of muscle. And the serosa is really the visceral peritoneum, the protective outer connective tissue layer that surrounds the organs. So the mucosa is what lines the lumen, and there are three sublayers: the epithelium, the lamina propria, and the muscularis mucosa. There are really three main functions that the mucosa serves, and um, each layer, each of these sublayers performs one or even all three of these functions. So the three functions of the mucosa include secretion, so secreting mucus, digestive enzymes, hormones. That mainly takes place in the epithelial layer. Absorption of the end products of digestion, which really happens more in the lamina propria, where you have a lot of the capillaries for nourishment and for that absorption. And there's also protection against infectious diseases. So you have that mucosa associated lymphoid tissue, the lymphoid follicles in the lamina propria as well. And then in the muscularis mucosa, you have the smooth muscle for more local movements of the mucosa. So as far as the functional anatomy goes, we're going to start with the mouth, which is really bounded by the lips, the cheeks, the palate, and the tongue. And this tends to be, or is, lined with stratified squamous epithelium, much like our skin is. And if you think about why, it's mainly because of the amount of friction and abrasion that this area is subjected to, and you might lose layers of skin or layers of epithelium, and you might want to make sure that you have multiple layers of stacked cells to account for that abrasion. So you can look at the next slide as well to see the main structures that are found in the mouth. So you've got the vestibule, which is which is recessed internal to the lips and cheeks and external to the teeth and gums. The oral cavity proper, which lies within the teeth and gums. The labial frenulum, which is the meeting attachment of each lip to the gum. You've got both the hard palate and the soft palate. The hard palate involves the palatine bones and palatine processes of the maxillae, and they're slightly corrugated to help create friction against the tongue. And this is to help you form the bolus when you're chewing. And the soft palate, which is the fold formed mostly of skeletal muscle, and this is what closes off the nasopharynx during swallowing. And there's a little uvula which projects downward from its free edge, which is what helps with your gag reflex. The functions of the tongue include repositioning and mixing food when you're chewing, forming that bolus before swallowing, and initiating that swallowing process, and also playing an important role in speech, and of course with all the taste buds and taste. There are both intrinsic and extrinsic muscles, skeletal muscles. The intrinsic muscles really change the shape of the tongue, and the extrinsic muscles are what alter the tongue's position within the mouth. And that lingual frenulum is that little connective tissue that attaches the tongue to the floor of the mouth. On the surface of the tongue, there are papillae, which come in a number of forms. So there's the filiform, which are the whitish ones, and they give the tongue that roughness, and they provide friction, and but they don't contain taste buds. You've got the fungiform, which are the reddish ones, which are scattered all over the tongue, and they contain taste buds. the circumvallate or the valate or the V-shaped row, which is in the back of the tongue, and they contain taste buds. And there's something known as the foliate ones, which are on the lateral aspects of the posterior tongue, and they contain taste buds, but they primarily function in infants and children, so not much of a function in adults. There's also lingual lipase, which is a fat digesting enzyme, which becomes functional in the stomach, and that's secreted by the serous cells found beneath the foliate and valate papillae. And there's also something known as the terminal sulcus, which is really a landmark, which marks a division between the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, which is in the oral cavity, known as the body, and the posterior third, which resides in the oral pharynx, which is the root. There are two main groups of salivary glands, the extrinsic salivary glands and the intrinsic salivary glands, and there are also two types of secretory cells in the salivary glands. So the extrinsic salivary glands, these are the ones that produce most of the saliva, and they lie outside the oral cavity. So you have the parotid, the submandibular, the sublingual salivary glands. The intrinsic salivary glands are more scattered throughout the oral cavity, and they are really meant to augment the production of saliva a little bit. The two types of secretory cells are serous cells, which are found in the parotid and submandibular salivary glands, and they produce the watery saliva with enzymes and ions and a bit of mucin included, and the mucus cells, which are mainly found in the sublingual salivary glands, really produce the mucus. This diagram outlines the location of the different salivary glands, and as far as function goes, there are a number of functions that saliva carries out, one of which is to cleanse the mouth. It's also involved in dissolving food chemicals for taste, so you can actually taste the food that you're eating. It moistens food, helps to compact it into a bolus for swallowing, and it also begins the breakdown of starch with the salivary amylase. Saliva is mostly made up of water, and it is slightly acidic. You can see that there's by this list of all the other components that make up saliva. As far as how much saliva we produce, roughly 1,500 mils per day, depending on activity and how much you're eating. So there's the two types of salivary glands. The intrinsic glands really try and keep the mouth moist, continually moist, and the extrinsic salivary glands are really activated when that parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest nervous system, is activated. Along those same lines, if you have a strong sympathetic stimulation, so the fight or flight, that actually inhibits salivation, and that's what results in that dry mouth, which, if somebody gets nervous or anxious or frightened, sometimes they get that real dry mouth. The teeth are an excellent example of how structure reflects function, and the type of teeth that the different organisms have and the numbers of those teeth and their distribution really reflects the type of food that that organism eats. So for us, we have teeth that help us tear and grind food for digestion. So there's both primary and permanent dentition. So we call your deciduous teeth, which erupt in that 6 to 24 months of age, and they tend to fall out between 6 and 12 years of age as the permanent teeth develop. And then you end up with your permanent teeth, which there are 32 permanent teeth, and usually all but the third molars, what we call our wisdom teeth, erupt by the end of adolescence, and that those third molars sometimes don't erupt. They might erupt early, around anywhere from age 17 or later up to 25, or in some cases they don't erupt at all. The four classes of teeth that we have in our mouth are incisors, which are the chisel-shaped teeth for cutting, the canines, which are the fang-like teeth that tear or pierce our food, the premolars, also known as the bicuspids, which are they have broad crowns and the rounded cusps, and they're for grinding and crushing, and the molars, which also have the broad crowns and rounded cusps, and they really are our best grinders. Now those four classes of teeth are what generates our dental formula. So for adults with our permanent teeth, we have a dental formula known as 2-1-2-3, which really represents 1/4 of your mouth. So the 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 premolars, and 3 molars. That dental formula is different in the deciduous teeth, so which only have 20 teeth in total. So their dental formula is 2-1-2, which is 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 molars. So they're lacking any premolars, and they're also missing a molar. But it's really, when we talk about dental formulas, we really go by the permanent teeth dental formula. So for our 32 teeth, it's 2-1-2-3. As far as tooth structure goes, it's really divided into 2 parts. The part which is above the gum line, which is the crown, made up of enamel, which is the hardest substance in the body. It's made up of calcium salts and hydroxyapatite crystals. Um, when the tooth erupts, the enamel producing cells actually degenerate, so there's no more enamel that is produced after the tooth has erupted, which is why there's really no healing if the tooth cracks or if there's tooth decay, which is why we go to the dentist and we get it filled in with something that is enamel-like, because we can't produce our own enamel after the tooth has erupted. And then the root, which is the portion which is embedded within the jawbone. As far as the roots go, if we look at the different classes of teeth, the canine, incisors, and premolars have 1 root. The first 2 upper molars have 3 roots. The first 2 lower molars have 2 roots, and the third molar roots vary. They usually often have a single fused root. Continuing with tooth structure, get into a bit more of the specific structure. So the cement is the calcified connective tissue. This is what covers the root and it attaches it to the periodontal ligament. The periodontal ligament itself is what forms that fibrous joint called the gomphosis, and this is what anchors the tooth in the bony socket. The gingival sulcus is the groove where the gingiva borders the tooth. Dentin is the bone-like material under the enamel, and this is what's maintained by the odontoblasts of the pulp cavity. The pulp cavity itself is what is surrounded by the dentin, and that pulp is what has the connective tissue and blood vessels and nerves. The root canal is like the channel, whereas as the pulp cavity extends down into the root, and the apical foramen at the proximal end of the root, this is the entry point for the blood vessels and the nerves. For the homeostatic imbalances that affect the teeth and the gums, the tooth and gum diseases include dental caries or cavities. This is the demineralization of the enamel and the dentin from the action of bacteria. So it starts with plaque, which is really a film of sugar, bacteria, and other waste material, debris that sticks to the teeth, adheres to the teeth. This is the stuff that you have to get scraped off at the dentist if you haven't been taking care of your teeth. The bacteria themselves will produce acid, which dissolves the calcium salts, and the proteolytic enzymes that they produce digest the organic matter, and this is what creates that hole or the cavity in the tooth. And like I mentioned before, the enamel does not get replaced, and so you get extra sensitivity in the tooth and pain, and the only way to really fix it is to get it filled in. You can help yourself by brushing and flossing on a regular basis to prevent this plaque from ever building up. Also, if the next stages would be the gingivitis, which is that plaque calcifies to form tartar, or that calculus, which disrupts the seal between the gingiva and the teeth, and this is where the anaerobic bacteria can get in and they can infect the gums, and this is This infection is reversible if the tartar is removed, um, but tartar actually is the main material that you get really scraped off your teeth. The plaque is more that film that you might feel at the end of the day if you know you haven't brushed your teeth yet and you get that film. But the tartar is really the stuff that you get scraped off. Um, and if again if you ignore the gingivitis, which is the inflamed gums, then you get into periodontitis, which is you know the immune cells will start attacking the actual body tissues, and you start losing the periodontal ligament, and the osteoclasts get activated and they start dissolving bone, and this is when you end up with potential tooth loss, and there is some connection between periodontitis and things like atherosclerosis and clot formation in the coronary and cerebral arteries, so things that could lead to heart attacks and strokes. These are all promoted or risk factors for periodontitis include things like smoking and uncontrolled diabetes, even things like oral piercing. As we pass from the mouth, we go into the pharynx. In the pharynx, you have the oral pharynx, the laryngopharynx, and this is like the passageway for food and fluids and air. It goes down into the esophagus, which is that flat muscular tube where the peristalsis begins. Um, the esophagus actually pierces the diaphragm at the esophageal hiatus and joins the stomach at the cardial orifice. And there's a gastroesophageal, also known as the cardiac sphincter which surrounds that cardiac orifice, which controls movement of material from the esophagus into the stomach. The esophagus contains stratified squamous epithelium, so those multiple layers of flattened cells, again to deal with the abrasion and the friction that the esophagus might be exposed to, so it can lose layers of cells without damaging the underlying tissue. And it also contains glands which secrete mucus, which help in the movement of the bolus uh, by the action of peristalsis. Heartburn caused by acid reflux, acid movement, or acid vapors moving from the stomach into the esophagus and causing that burning sensation. It can be caused by a number of things. It can also be related to something known as a hiatal hernia, which is a structural abnormality where the portion of the upper stomach gets pushed up through the diaphragm, and you end up with this herniation, and the esophageal sphincter remains open, and you get this constant burning acid feeling in the esophagus. Long term can lead to things like inflammation or esophagitis, can promote the formation of esophageal ulcers and even esophageal cancers. So if we take a step back into the mouth and get into the more of the specifics of the digestive process, we've already talked about the ingestion, getting food into the mouth, but and the mechanical digestion, the chewing that happens in the mouth, propulsion, or something known as the deglutition, or the swallowing of the food, and the chemical digestion, where the salivary amylase and the lingual lipase actually start the chemical digestive process. There's really no absorption except for a few drugs that get absorbed in the mouth. Nitro is an example of one that gets absorbed, but for the most part, this is really just the beginning of the digestive process, not the absorptive process. So for these last couple of slides, we'll just talk about the chewing or the mastication, which involves holding the food between the teeth and cutting it and grinding it. The tongue, which mixes the food with saliva and compacts into a bolus, and then it's swallowed. And we get into the deglutition of the swallowing, which involves the tongue, the soft palate, the pharynx, the esophagus, and it actually involves coordination of 22 muscle groups. There are five phases, and you can look at them on the following slide in the diagram, but we'll just talk about the buccal phase, which is really the voluntary contraction of the tongue, and the pharyngeal esophageal phase, which is the involuntary, usually primarily involves the vagus nerve, and it's the control centers in the medulla and the lower pons, which allows this the movement of the bolus through the pharynx and into the esophagus. So I think we'll stop there at this point, and we'll pick up on the second part of the digestive system in class next week. And again, if you have questions, you can feel free to email me, or if they can wait until our class, then we can go through and make sure that everything that we've covered in this short presentation is clear.